In this episode, we're going to take two ideas that people love to mention in passing, tokenization and P2PE, and turn them into something you can actually reason about as a QSA without falling into marketing language or false confidence. Beginners often hear that these technologies can /scope, and they absolutely can, but only when they are designed and operated in a way that truly removes cardholder data from the parts of the environment you want to exclude. If you accept vague claims like we tokenize everything or we use encrypted terminals, you can end up scoping incorrectly and building an assessment story on top of assumptions that do not hold. The real skill is understanding what tokenization and point-to-point encryption are trying to accomplish, what conditions must be true for scope to shrink, and what evidence shows those conditions are actually true in day-to-day operations. When you get this right, you not only reduce assessment effort, you also reduce real risk, because fewer systems ever have the chance to touch sensitive payment data. That combination of less exposure and clearer boundaries is why these approaches are so powerful when they are implemented properly. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful place to begin is with the scoping principle that makes tokenization and P2PE meaningful, because both are really about changing where cardholder data exists and where it can be accessed. Scope is driven by the cardholder data environment, CDE, which includes the people, processes, and technologies that store, process, or transmit cardholder data, plus systems that can impact the security of those components. If you can redesign the payment flow so that the organization's general networks and systems never store, process, or transmit the sensitive data in the first place, then the CDE can become much smaller. That is the real mechanism behind scope reduction, not a special exemption or a friendly interpretation. Tokenization and P2PE are both methods for changing the data flow story so that sensitive values are either replaced with safer stand-ins or protected in a way that prevents exposure to the merchant environment. The trick is that the words alone do not change scope. Only the actual data handling does. As a QSA, you are always asking the same question in different forms. Where does the sensitive data appear, even briefly, and what systems could influence its protection at that moment? Tokenization is easiest to understand when you think of it as a substitution system that tries to remove the most sensitive value from everyday business processes. On first mention, it helps to name the sensitive value explicitly, because it is the center of the conversation. Primary account number, PAN. The PAN is what many people think of as the card number, and it is a key piece of what makes payment data sensitive. In a tokenization model, the PAN is captured and sent to a token service, and in return the merchant systems receive a token, which is a replacement value used for storage, reporting, refunds, and recurring billing workflows. The big benefit is that if the token cannot be used to reconstruct the PAN within the merchant environment, then systems that store only tokens may no longer be handling cardholder data in the same way. That can reduce scope because fewer systems store or transmit the real sensitive value. However, the details matter because not all tokens behave the same and not all implementations prevent the merchant from having access to the original value. Tokenization slashes scope only when the merchant environment truly does not retain, process, or transmit the PAN after tokenization occurs. A beginner pitfall is assuming that any token means the environment is safe, but a professional approach treats tokenization as a design that can be strong or weak depending on how it is implemented. Some token systems are designed so the token is meaningless outside the token service, while others are designed so the token is tightly linked to the original value and can be reversed or mapped back easily by systems the merchant controls. When the merchant can detokenize freely, the token does not meaningfully reduce exposure, because the merchant environment still has the ability to access the PAN. Even if detokenization is rare, the ability matters because it defines what systems can influence the security of card data. Another pitfall is assuming the token service is always out of scope, when the token service might be a third party that stores or processes the PAN and therefore becomes a critical part of the compliance story. What changes is not that the responsibility disappears, but that responsibility shifts to a smaller set of systems and often to a provider relationship that must be governed. Tokenization can be a scope reducer, but only if the tokenization boundary is real, enforced, and supported by evidence rather than by wishful thinking. To evaluate tokenization defensibly, you want to trace the exact moment where tokenization happens in the payment flow, because that moment defines the boundary of exposure. If the PAN is captured in a web form that posts directly to a third party, and the merchant servers never receive it, that can be a powerful scope reduction, because the merchant environment may only handle tokens. If the PAN is captured by a merchant application server first, and then sent to a token service, the merchant server is in the CDE because it handled the sensitive value, even if only briefly. The same is true for point-of-sale systems, where the terminal might capture card data and then send it to a provider. The key question is whether the merchant network ever sees the PAN in clear form at any stage. Tokenization itself does not guarantee that, because data can be logged, cached, or displayed during processing steps that happen before token replacement is complete. A QSA becomes confident by insisting on a complete data flow story that shows where the PAN exists, where it stops existing in the merchant environment, and what artifacts prove that the merchant never stores it afterward. Evidence is the difference between a tokenization claim and a tokenization reality, and the evidence needs to support both design intent and day-to-day operation. Design intent evidence might include architectural descriptions of how payment data is captured, how tokenization is performed, and what systems receive tokens versus sensitive values. Operational evidence might include records showing that tokens are used consistently in downstream processes like refunds, customer support lookups, and reporting, without staff needing to access full card numbers. You also want evidence that detokenization, if it exists at all, is tightly controlled, because broad detokenization access can pull many systems into scope through influence and access pathways. A practical pro mindset is to ask what would happen if an attacker compromised a common system, such as a reporting tool or a support workstation, and then ask whether that attacker could obtain PAN from the systems that claim to store only tokens. If the answer is yes, scope reduction may be illusory. If the answer is no, and the evidence supports that, tokenization becomes a strong scope shrinker. Now let's shift to point-to-point encryption, because it is often confused with ordinary encryption that happens somewhere in the environment. Point-to-point encryption, P2PE, is about protecting card data from the point of interaction, such as a card-reading device, all the way to a secure decryption environment that the merchant does not control. The scope advantage comes from the idea that the merchant systems never see the card data in a form they can use, because it is encrypted immediately at capture and remains encrypted until it reaches a controlled endpoint. Beginners sometimes hear encryption and assume that any encrypted traffic means systems are out of scope, but the key is where encryption starts, where decryption happens, and who has control over those endpoints. If encryption begins after the data passes through the merchant system in clear form, then the merchant system is still handling cardholder data and stays in scope. If decryption occurs inside the merchant environment, then the merchant environment still processes cardholder data, and the scope reduction is limited. True P2PE aims to keep the merchant environment away from the clear data entirely, and that is what can dramatically shrink the CDE when implemented correctly. A critical beginner distinction is between encrypting data in transit and using a validated P2PE solution, because those are not the same thing in assessment terms. Encrypting data in transit is common and important, but it does not automatically reduce scope because systems can still touch the cleared data before it is encrypted or after it is decrypted. A validated P2P approach is designed so that the encryption and key handling model prevents the merchant from accessing the clear card data, and it typically comes with defined components and responsibilities that are intended to be assessed consistently. You do not need to memorize program names to grasp the core logic, which is that the merchant's responsibility can shrink because the sensitive data is protected and removed from the merchant's operational control earlier in the flow. However, it is not magic, because the merchant still must manage the devices, manage physical security, manage processes for handling exceptions, and ensure that the P2P components are used as intended. If devices are swapped, tampered with, or mismanaged, the protection can fail, and scope decisions based on P2P assumptions can become wrong. A pro-level approach is to treat P2PE as a strong control only when the entire capture-to-decrypt chain and the supporting operational procedures are intact. When you evaluate P2PE for scope reduction, you again trace the data flow, but you focus intensely on the point of capture and the boundaries around decryption. If a card is read at a device, you want to know whether the data is encrypted inside that device immediately before it can be exposed to the merchant network. You also want to know whether any component in the merchant environment can ever decrypt the data, because that would pull those components back into scope. In a true P2PE model, decryption happens in a secure environment controlled by a provider or a dedicated function that is outside the merchant's general systems, which means the merchant's internal networks may only ever see encrypted values. This is how scope can shrink dramatically, because systems that transmit only encrypted payloads without the ability to decrypt may not be handling cardholder data in the same way as systems that process clear values. Still, you must be careful about side channels, such as devices that produce receipts, logs, or troubleshooting outputs that might contain sensitive values. A pro QSA treats the entire operational reality as part of the data flow story, not just the intended cryptographic design. It is also important to connect tokenization and P2PE because in many modern payment designs they work together to reduce exposure across different stages of the workflow. P2PE can protect the data at capture and transit so the merchant environment does not see clear card data, while tokenization can provide a safe value for downstream business operations like refunds, reporting, and recurring services. When these systems are aligned, the merchant can operate day-to-day without needing to store or access the PAN, which is a powerful reduction of both risk and scope. However, alignment is where misunderstandings happen, because organizations can implement one piece and assume they got the full benefit of both. For example, a merchant might use tokenization for storage, but still allow clear PAN to appear in support processes, which undermines the scope reduction. Or a merchant might use encrypted terminals, but then manually key in card data during exceptions, which creates a separate data flow that bypasses the protections. A QSA avoids blind spots by asking how exceptions are handled, how refunds are processed, how customer support retrieves transaction data, and whether any of those workflows ever expose the PAN. Scope reduction requires consistency across normal and exceptional workflows, not just a clean main path. Another area where professionals stay alert is the difference between removing data and merely masking it, because masking can create a false sense of safety. Some systems display only part of a card number, and that can be helpful, but partial display is not the same as eliminating sensitive handling. In some cases, partial values can still be used in combination with other data to enable misuse. And even when they cannot, the existence of partial values can affect whether a system is considered part of the CDE, depending on what else it handles and what influence it has. Tokenization is strongest when the token is not derived from the original value in a predictable way and cannot be reversed without access to a controlled token service. P2PE is strongest when the merchant never possesses the keys or the ability to decrypt. When you keep these distinctions clear, you stop being impressed by surface-level protections and start focusing on what actually changes the risk story. This is especially important on exams, because questions often include answer choices that sound secure but do not actually change scope, and the correct choice usually reflects deeper reasoning about where clear data exists and who can access it. Evidence strategy for scope reduction is also about proving negative claims, which is a subtle but important idea for beginners. When an organization says we do not store cardholder data, you are being asked to accept a negative claim, and negative claims are dangerous because they are easy to say and hard to verify fully. A strong evidence strategy does not try to prove the negative by checking every corner of the environment, because that is often impossible, but it does use multiple lines of evidence to reduce uncertainty. That includes tracing data flow to ensure the design keeps clear card data out of merchant systems, reviewing operational workflows where data might appear unexpectedly, and examining artifacts like logs and reports for signs of sensitive values. It also includes understanding who has access to detokenization or decryption capabilities, because those capabilities can bring card data back into the merchant environment. The more your evidence shows that systems were designed to avoid handling clear data and that operations reinforce that design, the more confidently you can justify a smaller scope. If the evidence shows inconsistent workflows or uncontrolled access, the honest answer may be that scope cannot be reduced as much as hoped. A practical pro mindset also includes recognizing that scope reduction concentrates risk into fewer components, which can be good, but it changes what you must govern carefully. If tokenization is used, the token service and its key management become critical, and the relationship with the provider becomes central to the assessment story. If P2PE is used, the device chain, device management processes, and any provider-controlled decryption environment become central. This does not mean the merchant can stop caring. It means the merchant must care intensely about the smaller set of things that remain in scope. Governance of third-party service provider, TPSP, relationships becomes crucial here because a significant part of the security objective is now dependent on external services and defined responsibilities. A QSA will look for clarity in those responsibilities, evidence that the provider's controls apply to the service being used, and evidence that the merchant fulfills their own operational responsibilities, such as managing devices and responding to tampering concerns. Scope reduction without governance creates a different kind of blind spot, where the merchant environment is small, but the dependency risk is large and unmanaged. Pro-level thinking treats scope reduction and governance as inseparable. From an exam perspective, this topic is often tested through subtle wording that tries to lure you into assuming that encryption or tokenization automatically removes systems from scope. The strongest answers usually focus on where the PAN exists, whether the merchant environment ever handles it in clear form, and whether the merchant has the ability to decrypt or detokenize. Answers that treat tokenization as a universal exemption are usually weak, because tokens can be implemented in ways that still expose the merchant to card data. Answers that treat any encrypted transmission as P2PE are usually weak, because encryption in transit can still involve clear data endpoints inside the merchant environment. Strong answers also tend to mention operational realities, such as exception handling and device management, because those realities determine whether the secure design remains true in practice. When you are unsure, return to the simplest scoping logic. Follow the data, identify who can access the clear value, and identify what systems can influence that access. If scope is shrinking, it should be shrinking because those influence pathways were removed or tightly controlled, not because someone used a reassuring term. To conclude, slashing scope, using tokenization, and true P2PE is ultimately about redesigning the payment story so that the merchant environment never stores, processes, or transmits clear cardholder data, and so that only a small, tightly controlled set of components remain responsible for the most sensitive handling. Tokenization reduces scope when the PAN is replaced early with a token that cannot be reversed within the merchant environment, and when downstream processes truly rely on tokens rather than on sensitive values. Point-to-point encryption, P2PE, reduces scope when data is encrypted at capture, remains protected through transmission, and is decrypted only in a secure environment outside the merchant's general control, with operational processes that prevent bypass and exception leakage. Both approaches demand evidence that matches reality, not just design intent, and both require careful governance because reducing scope concentrates responsibility into fewer, more critical components. When you learn to follow the data, test the boundaries, and validate who can access clear values, these technologies stop being buzzwords and become practical tools you can evaluate with confidence. That is what it means to shrink scope dramatically in a way that stands up under scrutiny and genuinely reduces risk.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.